I've always believed that family was the one thing in life you couldn't lose, not by accident, anyway. My name's Ethan Calloway, and until last year, I would have sworn on everything I own that my parents and my younger sister were the only people who truly had my back. But trust, as I learned, is a fragile thing. Once it breaks, it doesn't shatter, it rots. It all started with something small. Funny how the biggest disasters usually do. I was sitting at my desk one Monday morning at Stenwick & Grayson, the corporate law firm where I'd worked since graduation. The phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Karen Holloway from First Cedar Credit Union. Polite, professional, but there was something clipped in her tone. "Mr. Calloway, we just need to verify some details about the loan application you submitted last week." The words barely registered. I didn't submit any loan application. There was a pause on the line. I could practically hear her scrolling through her computer. "This was filed under your name and social security number, sir. Documents include tax returns, employment verification, everything checks out, but protocol requires verbal confirmation." I told her there had to be a mistake. She apologized, promised to flag the file, and hung up. I stared at the receiver long after the call ended. A weird knot settled in my chest, but I brushed it off. Maybe a clerical error. These things happen. Or so I thought. The following weeks were a blur of similar calls. Banks, credit card companies, even a luxury car dealership. Each conversation left me feeling like I was trapped inside someone else's life, a life I hadn't agreed to. Then the letters started arriving at my apartment. Pre-approvals. Confirmations. Payment reminders. At first, I was embarrassed. I thought maybe I'd signed something without reading, maybe I'd mixed up documents during tax season. But the deeper I looked, the more impossible it became to deny. Someone had been using my identity. And they were good at it. When I finally sat down to map it all out, the pattern became clearer. The IP addresses on some of the applications were local. The financial activity always circled back to a handful of investment accounts and mortgage loans I'd never heard of. All the paperwork was crisp, professional. The signatures almost perfect. It didn't make sense until I noticed something in the address history linked to the bank profiles. My parents' house. The home I grew up in. I remember the night I drove there, heart pounding so hard I couldn't hear the music in my car. My sister, Mia, greeted me at the door. She looked the same as always, cozy old sweatshirt, bare feet, face lit up with her usual smile. Nothing about her said, "thief." My parents were in the living room, wine glasses in hand, chatting about my father's recent fishing trip like everything was normal. And for a moment, I convinced myself I was overreacting. But that night, as I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, I noticed the laptop on Mia's desk was still open. I got up, wandered over, and glanced at the screen. There, in her browser history, were logins to half the financial institutions that had contacted me. That was the first crack. The first whisper in the back of my mind that maybe, just maybe, the people I trusted most had been building their lives on the back of mine. I didn't confront them that night. I couldn't. My stomach was a tangled mess of denial and fear. Instead, I drove back to the city the next morning, gripping the steering wheel like it could anchor me to the version of reality I wanted so badly to believe in. But the truth has a way of catching up to you. And this was only the beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, emails, and sleepless nights. But no matter how many times I dug through the documents, no matter how many conversations I had with the banks, I couldn't deny it. Someone had been using my identity to open accounts, take out loans, and even secure investments. It felt like I was being pulled into a storm I didn't even see coming. I tried to keep everything together at work, pushing the thoughts of the growing nightmare to the back of my mind. But every time my phone rang, or I saw another envelope addressed to me with a new account number, it was like the walls were closing in. The weight of it all began to suffocate me. It wasn't until I sat down one evening, finally forcing myself to look at the complete picture, that the truth began to settle in. This wasn't just some random case of fraud. This was personal. I'd always believed my family was untouchable. I was the oldest, the one who had made it. My parents had worked hard to provide for us, and in return, I'd made sure to help them whenever I could. My sister Mia, always the youngest and the most free-spirited, had always relied on me for advice, for guidance. They were my anchor. I told myself that the calls and letters were just mistakes, technical errors. I told myself that it couldn't possibly be them. But then I found the old file. The night I discovered it, I'd gone back to my parents' house, determined to confront them. I told myself I wasn't leaving until I got answers. My mother, Caroline, had always been meticulous, almost obsessively organized. So when I slipped into her home office that night, I wasn't surprised to see the file cabinet meticulously arranged, just like I remembered from when I was a kid. But it was the folder on top that caught my eye. It wasn't labeled with anything typical, no tax returns or receipts like the rest of them. This one was simple, Riverpine. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside were documents, business contracts, emails, bank transfers, and something I couldn't immediately identify. But the thing that made my stomach twist was the name at the top of the emails. Ethan Callaway. The same name I had been seeing on all the fraud reports. But these emails weren't to me. They were from my mother, signed by her, but the sender's name was always a different business entity, one I'd never heard of, Riverpine Financial. I read through the documents in disbelief. They detailed a series of investments, large withdrawals, and even loans that were taken out in my name. Everything seemed calculated, carefully planned. The more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just one mistake or one instance of fraud. This was orchestrated. But the real kicker? My name had been used as the face of the operation. A high-end financial firm that had never existed. The company had been sending out glossy brochures, claiming to offer exclusive investments that were linked directly to my name. The very name I'd worked so hard to build up. The cold, heavy realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a full-scale exploitation of everything I'd worked for. I spent the rest of the night in that office, rereading the documents over and over. There was no denying it now. My family, the ones who I thought knew me best, the ones who I had helped through so many years, had used me as a pawn. The next morning, I did what I thought I'd never have to do. I called a lawyer. I knew there were only so many ways this could go, and I wasn't ready to face it yet, but I knew I had no choice. I had to take action. The day after I hired the lawyer, I received a call from an investigator working with the FBI. They wanted to meet. They said they were working on a federal case related to identity theft and financial fraud, and my name had come up. At that moment, I felt something inside me snap. The cold, clinical part of me wanted to simply end it, close the door, bury the truth. But the more I listened to the investigator, the more I realized I couldn't run from this. Not anymore. I had no idea how deep this went, or what I'd lose in the process, but one thing became clear: my family's web of lies had extended far beyond just me. I scheduled the meeting. It didn't take long for the truth to catch up with me. What I thought were isolated incidents of fraud quickly spiraled into something much bigger, something much more dangerous. Every time I peeled back a layer, another one emerged, revealing a tangled web of deceit that stretched far beyond my family. The day I met with the FBI investigator was the moment everything shifted. He was an unassuming man, quiet, steady. His name was Samuel Reed, and he wasted no time diving into the details. He started by confirming the basics. My identity had been used to open 3 separate credit cards, 2 business loans, and a fake investment firm under my name, all with massive withdrawals tied to them. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "At least 5 years," Reed said, his eyes never leaving the documents spread out on the table. "We're still tracing the full extent of it, but the money's been funneled overseas, offshore accounts, shell companies. It's more than just a few bad decisions. This is organized, and it involves people you know." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Who?" I forced the word out, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. "We've traced a few of the transactions back to accounts registered to your father, David Callaway. We also found links to your sister, Emily Callaway," Reed continued, pulling up images of bank records on his laptop. "We're looking into whether your mother, Caroline Callaway, was directly involved, but it's clear her name came up a lot. The flood of betrayal was overwhelming, but what truly shook me was the realization of how deeply this went. It wasn't just a few bad choices. My family had been living a lie for years, using me, my name, and my reputation to build a fake empire. I left the meeting with Reed feeling more hollow than I'd ever felt in my life. It was one thing to suspect your family of betraying you, it was another thing entirely to have hard evidence staring you in the face. But there was no turning back now. I needed to confront them. And so, I set a meeting. It was a week before I could bring myself to sit down with my parents. It felt like an eternity, the weight of their lies heavy on my chest every moment I thought about it. When I finally called my father to set the date, his voice on the other end of the line sounded almost too calm, too normal. "Son, what's this about?" he asked, a hint of unease breaking through his otherwise composed tone. "I need to talk to you and Mom," I replied. "It's urgent." We set a time for the weekend. I spent the next few days preparing, rehearsing everything I planned to say. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment they walked through the door. My father, tall and imposing as always, was the first to speak. "What's this about, Ethan? Why the sudden need for a meeting?" I stood there for a moment, trying to collect myself. But the anger, and the hurt, came rushing back like a tidal wave. "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped, my voice trembling. "I know what you've done." For the first time, my father's eyes shifted uncomfortably. It was a subtle shift, but I caught it. My mother stood silently beside him, her eyes avoiding mine as if she already knew what was coming. I pulled out the folder Reed had given me, the one filled with the damning evidence. I tossed it onto the table between us. "You think I didn't know? I know about the fake accounts, the loans, the stolen money," I said, my hands shaking as I pointed to the documents. "You've been using me, using my name to cover your tracks for years. And now I'm left with the consequences." My father's face went pale. His lips parted, but no words came out. My mother finally spoke, her voice cracking. "Ethan, we didn't mean for any of this to happen. We were just trying to protect the family, to secure the future." "Secure the future?" I shouted, my emotions spiraling out of control. "By putting me in the middle of your mess? By using my name as a shield for your lies?" My father finally found his voice, but it was defensive, almost dismissive. "We never meant for things to go this far. You have to understand, we were just doing what we thought was best. We needed the money, Ethan. We were trying to keep the business afloat." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father, the man I had always respected, was sitting there justifying it all, trying to paint this as some kind of mistake. "I didn't ask for any of this," I spat. "I didn't ask for you to use my success to cover up your mistakes. You've ruined my name, my career. And for what? A quick fix." My mother's face softened for a moment, and I thought she might finally show some remorse. But when she spoke, the words that came out of her mouth were not an apology. "Ethan, you're overreacting. We thought we were helping. You've always been the responsible one, the one who could fix everything. We didn't mean for things to go this far." "I'm not the one who's overreacting," I said quietly, but with the strength I'd been holding back. "The truth is, I've always tried to make you proud. I've always tried to do what's right for this family. But you've betrayed me in the worst way possible." I left that meeting with no more answers than I had before, but now I understood something I hadn't before. The guilt, the shame, it wasn't mine to carry. I had been the one trying to fix everything, trying to save a sinking ship. But in reality, it had always been a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies. As I stepped out of my parents' house, the weight of their betrayal finally hit me like a brick wall. I had no family anymore, not the way I had once known it. What I had left were shadows of the people I had once loved, now just strangers who had used me for their own gain. But the worst part? They had never thought they'd get caught. They had never thought I would stand up to them. But I was done being the scapegoat. I was done playing their game. Now I had a choice to make. The easy thing would have been to walk away, to forget and move on. But I wasn't that person anymore. The days that followed my confrontation with my parents felt like they were stretching on forever. There was no resolution, no closure, just a constant undercurrent of tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. I knew that I needed to take action, but the question was how. How do you fight against the people who raised you, the people you thought you could trust more than anyone? It was that thought that kept me up most nights, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. My life had always been so carefully controlled. I had worked hard, built my career on integrity, and always put family first. And yet, in one fell swoop, everything had crumbled, and I was left standing amidst the wreckage. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings and discussions. I had never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office, staring at the paperwork for a civil suit, trying to figure out how to sue my own family. But here I was. The lawyer I had hired, Samuel Reed, turned out to be more than just an investigator. He was now my legal counsel, guiding me through what was going to be a long, painful process. I sat across from him in his modest office, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as he laid out the options. "First, we need to file a formal report with the authorities," Samuel said, tapping a stack of papers in front of him. "The evidence is undeniable. Your family's involvement in the fraud is clear. The key now is how we present this case to the court." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I could still hear my father's voice in my head, his excuses for everything they'd done. And my mother, her calm, rehearsed apologies, as if trying to soften the blow of their betrayal. "What's next after that?" I asked quietly. "What happens when we go public with this?" Samuel looked me in the eye, his expression serious. "We're going to have to go through a long legal battle. This will be messy, Ethan. Your family won't go down without a fight. But the truth is you have a strong case. The evidence is there, and we'll make sure the world sees it." The idea of bringing my family to trial was nothing short of terrifying. What would it mean for me? For my career? My reputation? Would I ever be able to recover from this? And more importantly, would I ever be able to forgive them even if I won? As the days passed, my emotions fluctuated between anger and despair. I still couldn't shake the image of my father's face when I confronted him. His eyes, once so full of confidence, had been empty, hollow. My mother, too, seemed to be struggling with the weight of everything. It was as if they had both been living in a fantasy world where they could keep getting away with it all. But despite their attempts to make me feel guilty, I knew I had no choice but to follow through. I had to hold them accountable, not just for my sake, but for the sake of everyone else they'd hurt along the way. The media caught wind of the case soon after. It didn't take long for my family's name to start showing up in the headlines. The public eye was unforgiving, and my parents' carefully crafted image of success began to crumble. Every day, new stories emerged, stories about their lavish lifestyle, their questionable business dealings, their greed. People who had once trusted them now began to speak out. Victims of their financial schemes came forward, sharing their heartbreaking stories. It was a strange feeling, knowing that my family's darkest secrets were being exposed to the world. At first, I wanted to bury myself in the ground and make it all go away. But then I realized something: this wasn't just about me. This was bigger than my family. This was about protecting others, about making sure no one else fell victim to the same kind of betrayal. One afternoon, as I was going over case files at my apartment, I received a phone call from a woman named Rachel. She was one of the victims who had lost everything to my family's fraudulent activities. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could hear the raw emotion in her words. "Ethan," she said, "I don't know how to say this, but I've lost everything. My life savings, my house, all gone. And it's all because of your family. I trusted them, trusted you. I never thought it would come to this." I felt the sting of her words, but I knew she wasn't blaming me. She was hurting, just like the dozens of others who had been deceived. I could feel the weight of her pain, and it broke me. It was no longer just about me and my family. It was about standing up for those who had no one else to turn to. "I'm sorry," I said softly, my voice filled with regret. "I wish I could have done something sooner. I'm trying to make it right, Rachel. I promise you, I won't stop until justice is served." We spoke for a while longer, and by the end of the conversation, I felt a little less alone. Rachel wasn't the only one who had been hurt by my family's actions. There were others, too, many others. And together, we were going to make sure they didn't get away with it. As the weeks dragged on, the legal process became a blur of hearings, paperwork, and court dates. I was no longer the person I once was. The man I had been before all this, the hopeful, optimistic son trying to make his family proud, felt like a distant memory. Instead, I had become something else, a fighter. A man who had been pushed to the edge by the people he loved most, but who refused to back down. And every day, I reminded myself that this battle wasn't just for me. It was for Rachel. It was for the other victims. And it was for the truth. The trial was set to begin in a few weeks, and I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. My family's fate, my own future, and the lives of the people who had been hurt, everything was hanging in the balance. The trial was scheduled to begin in a matter of days. The tension was palpable, not just in the courtroom but in the quiet moments before each hearing, when I would find myself staring out at the city, wondering how much longer I could hold on. The idea of seeing my parents in court, my mother, my father, and my sister, all accused of crimes that they had perpetrated, crimes that I had been too blind to see for years, was an experience I couldn't fully prepare for. I had spent weeks surrounded by legal documents, rereading every piece of evidence we had gathered, every financial statement, every piece of correspondence that would prove their guilt. But nothing prepared me for what I would feel when I walked into that courtroom. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with anticipation. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in front of me, my mind racing. Samuel, my lawyer, sat beside me, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside me. The prosecution team, armed with the weight of all the evidence, was ready. But what struck me the most was the emptiness I felt when I saw them, my parents. My mother, dressed in a dark suit, looked almost unrecognizable. Gone was the polished, perfect image of the woman who had once held all the power in our family. Now, she was nothing more than a defendant, her eyes darting nervously around the room. My father, seated beside her, appeared just as detached as he had been in the weeks leading up to this moment. There was no remorse in his expression, no regret, just the same cold, calculating look that had always been there when he was hiding something. And then there was Madison, my sister. She sat at the defense table, her face a mask of both fear and defiance. I couldn't bring myself to look at her for too long. The betrayal of it all, her role in their schemes, cut deeper than anything my parents had done. She had been complicit, and even though her lawyer argued that she had simply followed their instructions, I knew the truth. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution painted a clear picture of the fraud my family had committed, outlining how they had used my identity to open fake accounts, drain victims' savings, and falsify investment opportunities. But as the defense tried to poke holes in the case, I realized how much of this battle wasn't just about the legal fight. It was about facing the harsh reality of who my family truly was. When I took the stand to testify, I could hardly hear the questions over the pounding of my heart. Samuel had prepped me well, but no amount of preparation could shield me from the emotional weight of recounting the last few months. I had to talk about the phone calls from banks, the forged signatures, the fake loans that had been opened in my name. Each piece of evidence I presented felt like another nail in the coffin of the family I had once known. But the most difficult part came when I had to look directly at my mother and father as I described their involvement in the fraud. My mother's eyes were red, her face pale, but she said nothing. My father didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on me, as if I were a mere obstacle in his way. The anger within me rose, but I forced myself to remain calm. They were guilty. They deserved to face the consequences of their actions, and I had to make sure they did. As the days passed, I was called to testify again and again, each time reliving the same pain, the same sense of betrayal. But the more I spoke, the more I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for justice for myself. I was fighting for every person my family had wronged, for every victim who had trusted them, for every person whose life had been shattered by their greed. The prosecution brought in victim after victim, each one testifying to how they had lost everything. One woman spoke of how she had remortgaged her home to invest in a fund that didn't exist. A man talked about how he had trusted my father with his life savings, only to find that it had been siphoned off to foreign bank accounts. The stories were heart-wrenching, each one a reminder of the damage my family had done. It was overwhelming, but it was also eye-opening. These were real people, real lives that had been ruined by the very people I had once called family. As the trial drew to a close, I knew the verdict was nearing. But I wasn't sure how I felt anymore. There was no satisfaction in seeing my family face charges. No sense of relief in knowing that the truth had come out. What I felt was emptiness. How could I ever rebuild from this? How could I ever see them again as parents, as family, after everything they had done? That night, after the day's proceedings had ended, I stood alone outside the courthouse, my mind heavy with questions. I had done what I thought was right, but it didn't feel right at all. Justice, in this case, had come at such a steep price. "Are you okay?" Solstice's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to find her standing beside me. She had been with me through every step of this journey, offering unwavering support when I needed it most. "I don't know," I said quietly, looking out at the city lights. "I thought once we got to this point, once the truth came out, I'd feel better. But I just feel lost." Solstice stepped closer, her presence a comfort. "You're not alone in this, Ethan. You're doing the right thing. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It's going to hurt for a long time." I nodded, the weight of her words settling in. I knew she was right. But even though I didn't know how I would feel when this was all over, I did know one thing for sure: I would never go back to the person I had been before. And no matter what happened in that courtroom, I would make sure that I never allowed my family's mistakes to define me. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality, as if everyone in that room knew we were approaching the end of something monumental. The case had lasted for weeks, each day drawing us closer to the truth. Yet, as the moment of the verdict drew near, I felt no sense of victory. It wasn't the justice I had imagined when this whole nightmare began. It wasn't the clean resolution I had longed for when I first uncovered their betrayal. The judge entered the room, and the quiet buzz of whispers silenced instantly. I sat in my seat, feeling as though I were in a distant, detached dream. My family sat on the other side, their eyes cold, their faces stone-like as they awaited their fate. I had long ago stopped hoping for anything resembling remorse or redemption from them. They had shown me who they really were. The judge began to speak, his voice steady but firm. After weeks of testimony, evidence presented by both the prosecution and defense, and the accounts of victims whose lives have been shattered by these actions, the court has reached its decision. My heart pounded as I felt the weight of every word, the weight of all the lives my family had destroyed, crashing down on me. He named them one by one, the sentences hanging in the air like a hammer ready to fall. "Gordon Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. My father didn't react, his face as expressionless as it had been throughout the trial. "Helen Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. My mother, pale and trembling, dropped her gaze to her hands in her lap, but said nothing. "And Madison Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. My sister's eyes brimmed with tears. But her tears weren't for the victims. They were for herself, for the life she had lost, for the family she had once thought she would have. The room was silent, a stillness that seemed to swallow everything. I stared at my family, unable to process the enormity of the moment. This wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was the end of everything I had known. The police began to usher them out of the room, and I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. There would be no reconciliation, no second chances. They were gone, lost to their choices, their lies, their greed. As Madison passed by me, she turned her face toward mine. Her eyes were full of guilt and regret, but it wasn't enough. I had already moved beyond forgiveness. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it would go this far." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The betrayal was too deep, too far-reaching. I had known the truth for far too long to ever go back to being the person I was before. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding. Not just my career or my reputation, but my entire life. I had spent so many years defining myself by my family, by their expectations of me, that I had forgotten who I truly was. Now I had to learn again. And it wasn't easy. But that's when the unexpected happened. 1 week after the trial, I received an email that would change the course of my life forever. The board of directors at my law firm reached out, offering me a new position, a new role that I never saw coming. They wanted me to head up an initiative aimed at helping victims of financial fraud, especially those victimized by family members. The program was called Reclaim and Rise. They had been watching me throughout the trial and had seen the way I spoke about the victims, the way I had turned my pain into purpose. "We believe," the email said, "that no one is more qualified than you to lead this initiative, not just because of your legal expertise but because you've lived it. You understand the depth of betrayal and the courage it takes to rise above it." At first, I hesitated. I didn't know if I could take on something so personal, something so close to the heart of everything I had just been through. But then I realized, this was my chance to rebuild, not just my own life, but the lives of others who had been victimized by the very people they loved and trusted. I accepted the position. And with Solstice and Alex by my side, we began to lay the groundwork for the program. The hotline was launched, a website was set up, and within days, we had hundreds of people reaching out for help. The victims weren't just faceless statistics to me. They were people I knew. People who had been through the same gut-wrenching betrayal, the same gut-punching realization that their own families had turned against them. I remember one call in particular. A woman named Clara, who had borrowed every penny she could scrape together to help her son with his startup business, only to find out he had disappeared, leaving her in debt. She was devastated, feeling both the loss of her son and the financial ruin he had left behind. I listened to her story, offering her not just legal advice, but empathy and a space where she didn't have to hide her pain. "I trusted him," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought he was my family." I could hear the weight of her words, the same weight that had once crushed me. "You're not alone," I told her. "You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." It wasn't just about the victims' cases. It was about creating a community, a support system where they could heal, share, and rebuild. I had found my new family, not bound by blood, but by understanding, by shared pain, and by the desire to move forward, no matter the cost. The day of the first support group meeting came, and I stood in front of a room full of people who had been through the worst kinds of betrayals, from their parents, their siblings, their children. They were tired, broken, but they were still here. And in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. As I stood there, listening to their stories, I knew that my past, my family, would never define me again. It wasn't easy and the scars would never fully fade, but I had chosen to move forward. My journey had begun again.